Good afternoon, everyone. The time now is 3:12, and we are going to start our session of political polarization and the state of liberty. Please make sure you silence all of your cell phones, and we'll leave questions at the end for Q&A, and we'll have a microphone just to the right of the room. I'm going to introduce to you our moderator, Dave Sussman. He is a host at America's Voice News, and his popular show is called Whiskey Politics. And he interviews luminaries, politicians, and people from culture and economics. Dave has also been seen at Fox News and Fox Business. He is also a guest host at Real Side Radio on 52 stations. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I'm just going to do a quick introduction of the gentleman on our panel, the distinguished Representative Justin Amash. He is representative representing the, I believe it's the 3rd District in Michigan?
Right. Yes.
Since 2010. And with the 3rd District being represented since 2010, he is also a member of the Committee Oversight and Reform.
No, that's not true anymore.
Okay, not anymore. In fact, I was a little, as I was preparing the remarks here, I wanted to make sure that, Joe, you just, I'm sorry, Justin, you just left the GOP.
That's right.
And you are now as an independent.
Yep, and my committee assignment's gone as a result.
Well, I'm sure we'll get a little bit into this as well. In the middle, we have Alan Crawford. He is an author. And since the age of 26, in fact, he is also a contributor to the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, National Review, and many others, as well as a former Senate speechwriter. His latest book is How Not to Get Rich, The Financial Misadventures of Mark Twain. And then we have Scott Walter, who is the president at Capital Research Center. And at Capital Research Center, he was also the special assistant of domestic policy for George W. Bush. Welcome, gentlemen. The discussion this afternoon we're going to be having is about political polarization and the state of liberty. Before we get into this, I would love for each of your definitions, starting with you, Congressman, what is the definition of liberty?
Well, it's very difficult to define liberty. I mean, people have tried throughout the ages, and I don't think there's any one thing that really defines it. But what I would say is it's the ability to make use of your own will to decide how you want to live your life. And it's not being relegated to the arbitrary will of another person. So there's no perfect system of liberty that you can have when you have, millions and billions of people living together and working together. But what we try to do when we establish a government is try to maximize liberty and minimize coercion by other people, by the arbitrary will of people through the state.
Alan?
My answer to this is probably, are we on?
Yes, a little bit closer.
Is probably a little bit different from the definition that would be offered by most of the people at FreedomFest, in the sense that I don't think liberty as a political term is quite the same as individual freedom. And I think this is a distinction that is often lost, especially in discussions of the foundation of this country, in which the idea of individual freedom seems to have been developing over a longer span of time, and what the founders and the revolutionaries were really looking for was a system of liberty in the sense that as a collective and as a society and as a government, they could make decisions for the American colonists independent of England. And I think that's still a useful distinction to maintain so that we don't get confused in some of these highly abstract terms.
Thank you. Scott?
Well, I would agree with the congressman that it's a very difficult term to define, and Alan makes great distinctions about the different levels that it applies to. I guess my not very brilliant, simple way of putting it would be liberty is freedom from coercion so that individuals can pursue virtue for themselves and that so that they can freely join with others to try to achieve goods in common.
We're also going to be talking about political polarization, and I think many of us would agree that we are more politically divided now than many we can remember in our lifetime. But in reality, I mean, we can all go back decades. We can always remember political divisions in our country. Are we really now more divided than ever, Congressman?
I don't know that we're more divided than ever. I mean, there are periods in history where we were very divided. We were very divided at the founding of the country, frankly. We were obviously very divided around the time of the Civil War. So we've had periods of history where we were, in my opinion, at least as divided as we are now, if not more so. And I would say that in modern times, we are approaching record levels of division. I don't recall at least a period of time during my life, and I'm still relatively young. I only really remember Ronald Reagan. So I don't, before that, I don't really remember presidents because, yeah, I had Jimmy Carter for just a few months as a baby. But I don't remember a time in my life when people were this divided, where people were so upset, had such contempt for one another, and I think that's really disheartening and is destructive to our system of government. A lot of times my colleagues miss the forest for the trees. I think they worry too much about the short-term wins and losses, and they're not worried about our system of government and how destructive animosity toward each other is to that system, because you can't have a system of liberty when people do not trust each other and when they hold each other in contempt all the time.
Okay. Let me ask you, this could be an open question for all of you on this, because when we talk about both parties, they have centralized power. You have the Democrats, you have the Republicans, the two major parties in the United States. Leadership is always focused on winning the next election, and it's top-down power. Doesn't that require these parties to draw the sharp contrasts between each of the parties? And otherwise, where would be the motivation for voters to come out and vote? Alan, do you want to start with that, or Scott? Thank you.
Scott, go ahead. You seem eager.
I actually am just old enough to remember the '72 election with McGovern, and I came from a very conservative libertarian family. And, McGovern was way crazy left. And America obviously thought that because he had a spectacular disaster of an election. And yet, McGovern would never have spoken about America the way that some members of Congress today speak about America. So I think, to your question on polarization, I think a major factor is there have always been a lot of disputes, often very heated, about what America should do and be, but there wasn't the raw contempt for America herself that you now see on college campuses and among some members of Congress. And I think that's a very disturbing thing. And of course, amusingly, McGovern, when he became a small businessman late in life, actually discovered that things like the minimum wage aren't great. So, he was thoroughly educable for all his seeming radicalism. So I think that's something to worry about. But you're talking about the only other thing I would say is you mentioned being top down. Part of the problem, too, I think, about the rising animosities is as the central government grows ever more powerful, you're going to have ever more brutal divisions. When people could live in Mississippi or Manhattan and have different ways of life, that was probably a very good thing for the whole country.
Alan, you would like to address something that is about the reform of the political process. And do you believe that trying to reform the political process has actually added to the polarization?
Yeah, let me go back. I'm the only person here that can remember the presidency of Chester A. Arthur, but so I have a perspective on this that goes back a little deeper. And I do remember, I first came to Washington in the 1970s, and I saw at that point the systematic destruction of the Republican Party by buccaneers coming in from the right who had decided that the party was impure and needed some kind of purification. You had this going on from the right, while on the left you had a systematic attempt to hamstring the party's Congress from acting in a way that was made for compromise and accommodation. And so we've seen for 40 years, we've seen the systematic destruction of the political party system in this country. And after 40 years of this, people are just surprised that the system doesn't seem to work. And this is, to me, is a greater threat in some respects to the freedoms that we cherish than a lot of things that get a lot more attention. I think that, yes, the level of frustration in this country at the political system is intense, but in a sense it's inevitable. It's totally predictable that people would say, would carry on the systematic destruction of the two-party system and then say, look, the system doesn't work anymore. It has to be thrown over in service of some other goal that is yet to be, that I haven't heard articulated in a way that strikes me as coherent. I think that you can attempt to reform the campaign finance system, for example, in such a way that the parties themselves are the amount of money that they can give to candidates is limited, while then the vast amounts of money that can be given basically by outsiders who are not part of the party system, what you end up with is a system in which the parties exercise almost no control over the candidates, which is why the Republican establishment opposed Donald Trump in the last election, and there would be 20 candidates on the stage, and only under that circumstance could a Trump who was opposed by the party win, just as we're seeing now the agenda set by the Democrats, not by Pelosi, but by AOC. So there's some very interesting dynamics going on in the parties themselves that account to a great degree, I think, for the frustration that leads to the bitterness of our politics today.
I think that opens the door to a question for Representative Amash. In your July 4th personal declaration in the Washington Post, you stated, "The two-party system has evolved into an existential threat to American principles and institutions." You not only left the GOP, but in a sense, the very concept of party affiliation.
Yeah, and I think in modern times, we don't need political parties the way we used to need them. I would say that the two parties operate mostly like scam PACs. I mean, you've seen these scam PACs. They try to raise money at the expense of people who are maybe, naive, falling for the scam. That's what goes on with these parties now. They're trying to raise money for you to perpetuate their own power. And the principles they claim to believe in don't really exist. They don't really have those principles. In modern times, with the access to information we have, we don't need parties in the same way we needed them years ago. In the early days of our country, people used parties as a proxy so that they could understand the candidates. The candidates were not accessible. Today, if you want to find out specifically about Justin Amash, it will take you a few seconds and you can learn anything you want. You want to learn about an issue, you want to learn about my life, you want to learn any fact about me, in a few seconds on your phone right now you can get that information. There's no need to have a party to tell you where I stand on any particular issue. If you want to donate to me, who cares what the party thinks? You can learn about me. So I think that right now they mostly serve to perpetuate their own power. And there are a lot of people who say things like, well, we just need to make the parties stronger. The problem is the parties are weak. But that's like denying reality. The reality is, because everyone has so much information and because so many more people are engaged these days, the parties are never going to go back to the way we imagine, in the ideal state where they are well organized and thoughtful, and they have a broad segment of the population represented. We can't go back to those days anymore. That world is gone because information has changed that world.
That accounts for the access to information, and I readily admit that where the parties used to be the disseminator of information about the candidates and the arriving at slates of candidates and all of that, that's gone. I agree with that wholeheartedly. That's in the business of selecting members of Congress. I don't understand, in the absence of a strong party system at the congressional level, compromise, accommodation, and the working out of the deep differences can be done by lone agents operating together without the disciplines that not certainly in any kind of golden age, but even 30 years ago, where Congress could work behind the scenes and actually come up with some kind of workable solutions, while not perfect, at least got us through.
If I might respond, I think that's a little bit like advocating for central planning. The idea of our system is that we send members to Congress to go represent their constituents within the confines of the Constitution. So we're bound by the Constitution, obviously. And we're supposed to go and deliberate and discover the outcome, not have it dictated to the people through dictation through their representatives. So we're supposed to go, and it's supposed to be a discovery process. And we are very far removed from that now. I think, speaking as a member of Congress who has served for the past 8.5 years in Congress, I know that if you open up the system, and if you allow members of Congress to offer their ideas, and of course there will be some limitations. We're not going to have like 1,000 amendments on a piece of legislation. But the Speaker's job is to look at all of the amendments, all of the ideas, and allow people to put enough things on the floor where we get a good cross-section of the ideas. Let us debate it. Let us deliberate. Let us discover what the outcome is for the American people. And I promise you the level of polarization will go down, because a lot of times the frustration people feel, why they get angry and why they point fingers, is because they're not allowed to participate. And when you're not allowed to participate and you don't have as many amendments and you don't have a variety of outcomes, what ends up happening is you just point fingers. You say the other guy is evil, the other guy is bad. I want a Congress where people are talking about ideas, and the only way you're going to talk about ideas is if you open up the system and stop centralizing everything in just a few political heads on each side of the aisle.
Scott, did you want to add anything to that?
No, it's good.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I think we've been most divided about the past couple of years, 3 years, and I think a lot of people are wondering, sitting in this room right now, is we now know that the FBI spied on at least 2 American citizens associated with the Trump campaign. This is one of the biggest divisions in our country. It's all the media and social media have been hurling at each other left and right. It's been a death match. Well, we know that according to Representative Jim Jordan, Carter Page, using a fake dossier, they went after him, spied on him as the basis of a secret warrant. And George Papadopoulos, set up by an FBI agent posing as a Cambridge professor's assistant. Representative Amash, for years, you condemned spying on American citizens. How do you square this?
Yeah, well, first, I would say that the things you presented are allegations. You present them as something we know. These are allegations, and if you talk to Jim Jordan, as I do, privately, and if you talk to a lot of my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle privately, they'll also confess that these are allegations, and they should be investigated. We should get to the bottom of it to find out what's going on. But at the end of the day, what people try to conflate is whether a couple warrants were obtained unlawfully with whether the investigation itself was unlawful. And you shouldn't conflate those things. You could have an investigation where there are some bad FISA warrants, and I would certainly be critical of that if that's what happened. But it doesn't mean that it undermines the entire investigation, nor does it mean that any president should be allowed to obstruct justice in the process. So I think we need to make sure we separate those things and not assume that because there are some allegations related to some FISA warrants, that the entire investigation should be stopped and the entire investigation should be obstructed. I think those are very separate things. And at the same time, you can see the hypocrisy in the entire argument that people lay out, because they are complaining about these warrants, and at the same time, many of them, like Devin Nunes, for example, are supporting FISA 702. We just had a vote on this a few weeks ago, and Nunes and many other Republican leaders joined with Democrats in supporting continued, unwarranted, no warrant, unconstitutional spying on all Americans. So all of your communications are able to be read by the federal government, the president, the attorney general. They feel it's okay to go after you, but oh no, don't bother the president. If you have a FISA warrant, a bad FISA warrant, the president should be allowed to obstruct justice, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's a very dangerous way to look at our government, to say that the president can do whatever he wants because he's the president. He doesn't have to follow the same rules as everyone else because there was allegedly a bad FISA warrant. But the government can still, this president can still spy on every single American, every single person in this room.
Gentlemen, is there anything else you'd add to that?
I would say that I've been extraordinarily impressed with how the positions Justin's taken on all these issues.
Scott. Thank you. Scott?
Well, I would say that I always admire courage in saying unpopular things and the rest, but if we're going to get into the broader situation, it seems to me that the previous administration's potential abuse, now you're right, we don't know yet, once the IG report and more, but as a possibility, I find that enormously greater than a president shooting his mouth off in the White House and being ignored by the other people in the room.
So I think both. This is again, I think, why we have such a divide, because one side sees it one way, the other side sees it another way, and the point I've been trying to make is both of these things are problems. But you can see that actually the administration does not really consider unconstitutional FISA spying a problem. The administration thinks it's a problem when it affects the administration. But when it affects all of you, they don't care at all, because President Trump himself signed FISA 702 into law. That's unconstitutional, unwarranted surveillance, no warrant. So he signed it into law and then acts like he's concerned. This year we're going to have another vote on metadata. This is the Edward Snowden program that was revealed. We're going to have another vote on that. It wouldn't surprise me if the administration says they want to sign that into law to reauthorize it. In fact, we've heard from administration officials that that's what they want to do. So it's important to care about both things. And right now what happens is Republicans care about one part of it and Democrats care about another part of it. And this goes back to the polarization problem we have in our government. We should care about all of it. And if you look back on the Obama administration, there was no one tougher on the Obama administration than I was. I was out there leading the charge when I found out about what Edward Snowden had revealed to the American people. I led the charge against the administration. And in fact, I offered the amendment to end the NSA spying program that went down in defeat very barely, but we put together a coalition of Republicans and Democrats to fight back. And I'm the only member of Congress who's had a veto threat against my amendment to stop unconstitutional surveillance by both the Republican president and by a Democratic president.
Well, let me ask you...
Donald Trump threatened it, and so did Barack Obama.
Let me ask you this, Representative, and I want everybody's opinions on this on the panel. No modern mass democracy has ever thrived without parties. And you founded the Freedom Caucus. You were right there up front, and you decided to walk away from the GOP. And I understand the reasons why, as you have explained here on the panel. And I don't know if that's something that's questionable still, because maybe social media can help and raise candidates to the level that modern parties do. But walking away from the fight with a party behind you that supported you in the Freedom Caucus, doesn't that weaken your ability to get the things done that you wanted to achieve?
Yeah, no, it doesn't. And it's not walking away from the fight. It's actually elevating the fight. I want to take the fight to a new level. I came to realize after years of doing this working within the GOP, founding the House Freedom Caucus. I was a founder of the House Freedom Caucus. The reason the Freedom Caucus was founded was to open up the process. The media have spun it over the years, and many people have spun it, and frankly, the Freedom Caucus themselves have spun it over the years into the idea that the Freedom Caucus is a conservative group. Not true. The Freedom Caucus was not founded as a conservative organization. The Freedom Caucus was founded as an organization based on opening up the political process. We were upset that the leadership teams were doing it top down and not allowing members to participate. We were fighting for both people on the left and the right. We wanted everyone to be able to participate and let the will of the people be reflected in the outcomes in Congress. And we walked away from that over the years. The Freedom Caucus walked away from that. And I think with President Trump's election, that's where we really took a step in the wrong direction in terms of how the Freedom Caucus operates. The GOP, in my opinion, is following a dangerous path, as are the Democrats, and focusing only on short-term outcomes and not on long-term viability. And we talk about political parties have been here through the beginning of our history, but we didn't have the level of communication when this country was founded where we could do without the political parties. I'm not saying that political parties have to go away. I'm saying they're not necessary. If people want to be part of a political party, that's fine. But they're not necessary, and they can be harmful if they have the level of concentration of power that we have now, where they keep out competitors and they try to control the system from the top down. And that's where we're at right now, and I think we can break away from it. We're at a point in history where we can break away from that.
Scott, do you have a reaction to that?
Well, I certainly second the effort by the Freedom Caucus to break open the process. We need much more argument in our politics, actually. Not necessarily more extreme polarization, but a lot more argument. I would love to see Congressman Amash arguing with the current leadership far more on the floor over amendments and in principles, and that's so I quite agree. On the other hand, I don't think that parties are at all an insignificant factor in having the federal government function better. They actually help. The congressman said, well, you can find anything out you want to about me in a few seconds. Okay, well, there's 434 other members of Congress and 100 senators. And then you got the president and the rest. I mean, it's the value of the parties is also that kind of argument and deliberation. Parties produce brands. Brands help people to understand things. And it matters when you have arguments within the party and change things. The party changes positions because of arguments. So I don't think at all that parties are the threat or the trifle in general, even though I completely agree that the current House leadership is deplorable, to use a term.
I would say, parties are brands, and these brands are not helping people right now. These are brands that have been harmful to the American people. They're controlling the process from the top down. When my constituents send me to Congress, or when you send your representative to Congress, you have an expectation that that member of Congress can participate in the process. I hear all the time from constituents, hey, can't you offer an amendment to this or change that? Or if you knew this bill was coming up, why did you vote no instead of just offering an amendment and trying to change it? 99% of the time, we don't have the ability to do that. It's that controlled. Under Paul Ryan, for the first time in our country's history, and this is continued under Speaker Pelosi, but under Paul Ryan, the first time in our country's history, members of Congress were never allowed to come to the floor to offer amendments. Every single amendment that was offered had to be run through the Rules Committee, which is controlled by the Speaker of the House. So the Speaker decides, does your amendment get to the floor, and it has to be pre-approved by the Speaker. It used to be the case that you could, and this is how our system is structured. It used to be the case that you could very frequently just bring your amendment to the floor, and as long as it was germane, you're getting a vote on it. That's the way the system was supposed to work. It's supposed to be open. Now you have to have it pre-approved, and guess what kind of amendments get to the floor under this system where there's pre-approval? Only amendments that don't do anything, or amendments that do something but have no chance of passing. So if your amendment does something and has a chance of passing, it's not getting onto the House floor.
I don't understand if the parties were as dictatorial as some would allege, I don't understand how the party could have opposed Donald Trump and in favor of many other candidates, and he still won the nomination. I don't understand on the Democratic side if the parties are that controlling that one of the two front runners last time wasn't even a Democrat. Donald Trump wasn't a Republican for most of his political life. Bernie Sanders wasn't a Democrat, and yet they are, of the three big stars of the party over the last few years, these people who are essentially political entrepreneurs who are not beholden to any party manage to set the agenda in a sense. And I think what you've seen revolts against Boehner, you saw revolts against Ryan, you're seeing revolt against Pelosi today, and the parties seem not quite as effective in perpetuating their own power as some people seem to believe.
Well, I mean, when you have like a presidential primary, of course you have plurality voting that can win in state after state. But when you talk about Congress, look at our leadership team. Nancy Pelosi was the speaker a decade ago, and she's the speaker again. It's the same person. When you had John Boehner, guess who the next in line was? So you had Eric Cantor, and you had Kevin McCarthy, and Paul Ryan was always considered as someone at the top. Those people were just moved up. Like when one goes down, the other one is considered the next one in line. Now, Cantor lost because he got primaried in his district and was defeated there. But generally speaking, they're just passing the baton on to the next person. Someone does not have a chance of winning a leadership position unless they are the person next in line. That's typically the way it is. Nobody thinks Kevin McCarthy is actually qualified to be the Republican leader. Nobody. Now, our colleagues do not think that. What they think, on a matter of skills, what they think is that he is the next person in line, he's been waiting his turn, he's been raising money and being the good party loyalist, and so there's no stopping him. He has more resources than everyone else. He's done more favors for other people. He has more connections than other people, and that's why he gets to move up. And the same thing will be true in the next generation. If McCarthy leaves, the next person who's done more favors and handed out more money and done more things for the lobbyists, that person's going to be next in line. And that's generally how the system works. It works the same on the Democratic side.
You know, this must be, and I say this sincerely, this must be immensely frustrating to be operating in that environment. And I have, Justin has my sympathy and admiration. He's done, and I wish him well in so much of this. The idea, though, that we could be replacing a badly damaged party system with something that has not been explained what it is also, I think, has the possibility, the potential of creating far more polarization and frustration and anger in this country than trying to build back the few structures that we still maintain on which our liberty rests.
I just want to say real quickly, if you have a question for anybody on the panel, please line up here. We need to have a microphone up here. And we're going to get to taking questions here in just a couple of moments as we're finalizing the last 10 minutes here.
I just want to follow
Yes.
up on that real quickly. So I'm not saying don't vote for any Republicans or don't vote for any Democrats or don't vote for any Libertarians. You can vote for someone who's in a political party. The point I'm making is if the person places the party above all else, which so many members of Congress now do, you will have a destructive system. The system will not work. You'll continue down the path, I think I'm losing my microphone. We'll continue down the same path that we're going, which is a system that does not work for the American people, where the will of the people is not discovered through the process, and where you're told what the law is rather than letting your representatives discover the law on your behalf.
Last question for you before we take questions from the audience. Democrats complain about the constitutional winner-takes-all contests in Congress, which they say overrepresent rural America and underrepresent urban America. They believe that there's a 6-point benefit to Republicans because of this. We've seen since 2016 a lot of Democrats coming out and talking about constitutional changes to the Electoral College or allowing 16-year-olds to vote. Don't you not need a major party to counter that when you've got people that are seriously trying to change the Constitution?
Yeah, no, you don't need a major party to counter that. You just need people to counter it. I mean, the idea that we always need someone to take care of us, like a government or a party or something else, I think is wrong. And it's completely contrary to the ideals of this country. We can fight and stand up for what we believe in. I don't support changing the Electoral College, and I don't like the idea of 16-year-olds voting. But we can fight those ideas on our own. We don't have to have a political structure. You can form coalitions. No one forced you to come to FreedomFest. You made a decision to do it and to form this coalition here today. You can do the same thing in other ways. But you should never allow any organization or coalition to dictate everything to you, whether it's a political party or FreedomFest or anyone else. You have to make decisions for your own lives, and that's what freedom is about. It's about making decisions for your own lives without having the arbitrary will of another decide things for you.
Thank you. And you want to respond real quickly?
The only thing I would add, though, is that it gets complicated. One of the probably the most profound observer of America was Alexis de Tocqueville, and the single most critical thing in America that he saw was not pure individualism, but associations. Now, he very much worried about he predicted perfectly the horrible big central government we now suffer under, and that the congressman does his best, the beast the congressman does his best to slay. But he made it very clear that joining with others was an absolutely central part of it. In fact, he called association the school of liberty. So if we are just the atomized individuals that in an extreme interpretation of what you were saying one might think, then I think we're going to be in a lot of trouble. And you're right, we're going to lose the sort of freedoms that things like the Electoral College grant us.
Yeah, but libertarians are for association. I want to make that clear. Libertarians are for voluntary associations, but no human being, whether a libertarian or anyone else, should hand over their card, basically, to someone else to make decisions for them. And that's what happens way too often now in government, where we are blindly following people, whether it's a party or a person or some other organization, and saying, you make the decisions for me, I don't want to think about it. We all have to be involved, we all have to be part of the process, and I encourage people to form all sorts of voluntary associations, but just be aware of the limit to those associations. You can't let other people think for you. You have to think for yourselves.
Thank you. Let's go to the audience, and I'm going to ask that you ask your questions very quickly and concisely so we can get as many through. Thank you.
Do you think that perhaps polarization represents a great opportunity to, shall we say, cast out parts of the country? For example, let California go its own way and become a communist state and not be part of the Union. I say as a resident of California, you have my permission to cast us out.
Who would like to address that?
I don't want to cast anyone out. I think we have strength in our union. I think that's important. But we have a system where obviously the states have a lot of control, have a lot of power under our Constitution, and they should be able to make decisions. And if California wants to make bad decisions, it should be allowed to make bad decisions.
At the end of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the biggest debate was how many people should a U.S. House member represent? 40,000 was the initial push. 30,000 was decided because Washington said 40,000 to 1 was inadequate for the interests and civil liberties of the people. 1911, they froze the U.S. House at 435 members. Each member at the time represented 250,000 people. At this time, each member of Congress represents on average 750,000 people, which is about 25 times what they said it shouldn't be. We now just add assistants. Perhaps much of what you're talking about might be a symptom of the fact that perhaps we need to add more reps. Questions for you.
Yeah, so I don't think we should add more reps. I do think that the districts are getting to the point where they're pretty big, but if you add more reps, you have let's say you went to like 1,000 representatives, I'm not sure how that body functions. The body becomes rather large. And even engaging with each other, talking to each other, offering amendments becomes very, very cumbersome. So there has to be some balance between having smaller districts and also not having the body be so large that it can't function properly.
Okay.
Hi, I understand the concept of a political party as a brand. That said, I'd like to know what then the Republican Party stands for, because I'm really sure that it doesn't stand for small government. As an observer of the Republican Party, granted not forever, I've only been here 20 years, but it just really does not stand for small government. And you mentioned the fact that when there is a change in position within the party, it seems that actually there's a conversation about it. What I've been observing certainly recently is that actually it really changes when the power changes hands. So the example of now Republicans not being for free trade, or actually not standing as vigorously for free trade, the Republicans, I mean, they've been for a lot of spending for a long time, but not caring about deficits. I mean, this is all real. And the Republicans have suddenly changed their position on going after company and suing them because they supposedly do not represent who they think they should be represented, their voices. I mean, so I'd like to know, my question is, if the political parties are brands, if they're brands, what does the Republican Party stand for?
So I don't know if the question's to me, but I know you'd mentioned me. The Republican Party stands for Donald Trump. And I think that's about all it stands for at this point.
What does that mean to you, Representative?
I think it means that it stands for whatever he says on a particular day. And if he says one thing, that's what it believes. And he could say the opposite thing the next day, and the party will believe that. And I think that is a frightening prospect. Not because the president is wrong about all of these things. In fact, I find that he's right on several issues. There are many things I agree with him on. I don't agree with his tone and approach, and there are many policy issues I also disagree with him on. But I think it's dangerous for any party to follow any one person, including me. It shouldn't follow me. It shouldn't follow Donald Trump. It shouldn't follow Nancy Pelosi. The parties shouldn't operate that way. They should, if you're going to have political parties, they should have some principles that they stand on. If people are going to say, I'm running as a Republican because I believe in X, Y, and Z, then the party actually should believe in those things and fight for those things. And they don't really fight for those things.
I'm just going to say I have so many follow-up questions to that, but I'm going to go back to the audience. I'd love to have you on my show.
Yeah.
Next.
Thank you. Given the current polarization and the populace as well as the governing body, what's your idea concerning, I guess, the status of it? Does the polarization of the people kind of feed the polarization of Congress, or is it vice versa, where the polarization of Congress feeds into the polarization of the people? And this is directed towards the panel as a whole.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. So earlier it was mentioned by the panel that there's polarization in the Congress itself, as well as polarization and its constituents. And it seemed to come across that that one kind of fed into the other. And I was just curious where the panel thinks, I guess maybe where it originated from and what might be perpetuating it. Like does the polarization in Congress feed into the polarization of the constituents, or is it perhaps vice versa?
Was chicken and egg? Which comes first?
Oh, I think that part of the that these things are interconnected, and as I said, the weakening of the parties has in fact led to the polarization and frustration, and then the response to that is that then we need further reform, and I think that's the applying precisely the poison rather than the cure. So I think that they are, one leads to the other, and we often get the chicken and the egg mixed up. Just as Donald Trump, I think, is a symptom. Pardon me, just a second. Is a symptom of a lot of this as much as a cause. I think that if the party structures were healthier these days, he would never have gotten the nomination.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that Donald Trump is a symptom of the problems we face. I would say that it's not clear where it started. I mean, we've always had polarization. It's not like there's been polarization since the founding. But the idea that it's gotten so out of hand, like where we have it today, I don't know exactly where that started. I think probably sometime a few decades ago when you started to centralize more power in the speakership and in the Senate Majority Leader. I think you created a situation where it became more of a self-feeding process. Like the Speaker can raise as much money as the rest of the Republicans combined or the Democrats combined, depending on whether it's Republican or Democratic Speaker. And because the Speaker has so much power and influence, decides the committee assignments and the chairmanships, et cetera, the more powerful the Speaker becomes, the more power the Speaker, the more likely people will follow the Speaker. So it's like it's self-feeding, and then people at home see what the party's doing based on what the Speaker or the particular party leader is doing, and then they follow suit, and then it feeds back up again. So it goes in both directions.
We just have a couple of minutes left, so if we could get a couple of real quick questions.
Justin, it sounds like what you're saying is that political parties have become obsolete for people, for the public getting their information. Is that a word that you would use?
I think, in a sense, what I would say is, because I understand the perspective of others on the panel, for example, and I've heard from others, and I think people say, well, the parties are too weak, and therefore we must strengthen them again. But the point I'm making is, the world we live in is not the world of the 1800s or even the 1950s. And in the modern world, we're just not going to have a situation again where people are not that informed about politicians or elected officials. And in this sort of environment, I think the political parties are, in a sense, obsolete. It doesn't mean that they'll go away completely. It just means this current structure we have where two parties dominate everything, I think is an obsolete system.
I'm sorry to inform everybody we are out of time. I want to thank Representative Justin Amash, Alan Crawford, and Scott Walker. Thank you all so much. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us here at Freedom Fest.